Yes, first I just want to thank both Klaus and Lut. I feel as though in listening to Klaus, I'm at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia with James Madison, talking about issues of freedom and agency. And when I'm listening to Lut, I am truly there in the Netherlands in 1781, etc., discussing the issues of freedom. And in my research on the American experiment, what they did was something different. They added freedom, yes, indeed, but they provided a transformative structure to move from freedom to liberty, from freedom of individual part to the whole. And that's what I really see what cybernetics and the problem is a problem, is if you don't distinguish what level you're on. If you don't get the parts going free and having your burgers and hot dogs in July 4th, you're not an American. But you're not an American if you just think about freedom, because it's that larger issue. And I love Lot's phrase, we are only epiphenomenons of our structures. So the question is, what are those structures there and how do they interact?
You know, Crystal, if I may, what they did as the first thing is they didn't discuss. They made the florin, the guilder. That's what they did as the expression of liberty. Make a common coin. Yeah.
There's many things in the commons that we can talk about that created epiphenomenon of liberty versus freedom versus the resulting pathologies that we're talking about. When we started, some of you weren't here, Jerry Chandler said, Christy, what's this thing about the problem is the problem? You keep on talking about it. And I made just a cursive comment, well, it's about stuttering, problem, but I actually meant it. I used to stutter, people couldn't understand me as a child. I solved it. But stuttering is a logical types problem. Left hemisphere, right hemisphere interacting, both male, dancing the male role. They are able to separate category and content. So it alternates back and forth. And I've seen that in experiments I've done with STEM education in violence-laced minority communities, where the brain freeze occurs, like stuttering, because they don't have categories to put things in sequence things, the ability to sequence. And that's one of the laws I want to be talking about, etc. But let me make this thing practical, because Jason talks about, well, what were your examples? I just want to talk about two conversations. One last night was with John Domenico Pico. He was at the UN. He has Alzheimer's now, deteriorating. But I asked him a simple question. Why did you seem to be a different type of diplomat? Because he's the guy who's helped stop the Iraq war after 10 years, 500,000 people killed, 2 million casualties. He stopped it in 10 days. He was able to get hostages out that no one else was. And a guy who's cognitively impaired now because of Alzheimer's, he was able to say, well, the difference is normal diplomats look for answers. And in the battlefields, in the capitals, they look for answers. I looked for better questions. He was able to go outside and look at the context of a bitter, so you had shuttle diplomacy from the US going to Baghdad, etc. They were all looking for answers. He was able to sit there and change the dynamics, the epiphenomenon of structure by restructuring the conversation. Second conversation I had this morning, this was with a woman named Rebecca Goldsby. She's at the Office of Naval Research. She's frustrated as hell. She says, these DOD people, they don't understand what social sciences are about, what anthropology is about. They're just going about their games, just frustrated as hell. Now, what's interesting is the Office of Naval Research is the one who in May 1959 went to Chicago, got 200 of the top scientists in the US and said, we know how to beat the Soviets. It's with this system cybernetic stuff of information technology, servo mechanisms, guided missiles, drones. They didn't have that then, but robots. They totally ignore the idea of thinking beyond the answers they have now. And so these are real problems we're talking about here when the problem is a problem, because they're not able to go at a different level and look at how do you change the dynamics of the epiphenomenon that Lowell talked about, that structures and continues to structure through its history the same results. So let me just share a few slides. I had a bunch of slides. I only want to do 4, so because I want the discussion to continue here. Let's see if I can find it here. There we go. Oops, let me go a little higher. Like a joke, you want to look at the last sentence. Requiring a dual description of mind, my mind, and the mind of the system you're part of. That's the joke ending. So let me go through this. When the problem's a problem, it requires systemic change, not just change. So how do we distinguish types of change? And our purpose here is cleaning up premises, epistemological error that Klaus talked about. And the most important thing is survival instincts. We have 18 intelligence agencies now in the United States. And let me tell you, they are so imbued with technologies, information technologies, that the Chinese or anyone else can literally flip our country overnight because we are so trapped in the way we see the world and don't see the larger system. So let me just go through a waterfall of changes and the differences. Simple change, isolated. Issue, dealt with current instruments, unidimensional force. It's, me outwards. Impact calculations. Purpose, agenda, will of the people. And we saw that in our previous administration. So you want to remove a boulder from a road, or if you're in, the cathedrals there and Henry II, kill Thomas Becket. You eliminate the problem. But you're looking at it as a noun, as a thing. And that has interesting consequences because there's systems behind things. Complicated change. It's a team of experts focused on a mission. Organization, conversations to accomplish a goal. Engineering, mathematics. You want to put a man on the moon. If you look at human history, what the hell were we doing? The first thing when we developed consciousness, we were sitting there developing a dual system of gods, God, etc., and how we organized and coordinated the people was building a pyramid, Stonehenge. I mean, the structures of the Mayans and the Aztecs, absolutely phenomenal, but it kept people busy. But then there's a line of complexity, and I want to say reflexivity, because I don't like the word observer. We've been trapped in this idea of observer because, well, I'm just observing things, right? No, it's much more than that. So that's when the problem becomes a problem. When you go into the other domain, and me being a cultural anthropologist, it's like going to a Japanese tea ceremony, and all of a sudden you see a bamboo pole, a string, and a rock suspended from that string. That means you have to take everything that you thought, move the barrier, and think differently and think openly. So when you go to the second level, logical types, how do you get beyond stuttering to a higher level to have a category and a content sequenced, right? Level 1, reflexivity. It's an examination of personally held perspectives, limitation, consequences of assumptions. It's an examination of one's own beliefs, judgments, practices. It's the current lens, let's say, your attitudes towards race. I went to the University of California, Santa Cruz, the History of Consciousness program. Most of the folks there, they weren't just Marxists, but we had Huey Newton, we had Angela Davis, we had the Howard Zinn group of the history of the people, women's studies, queer studies. These are people who all went out and created and seeded departments throughout the United States that we're dealing with now. It's that first level of, what are my beliefs? And that is very powerful, but it doesn't have a regulator in it. And that's why we have these left-right interactions now, whose history, etc. So there's a reflexivity of, you're a white guy, you know, blah, blah, blah. The interesting part, how do you get beyond that, is looking at how systems regulate and stabilize. And that's level 2 reflexivity. It's the metastructures of language, communication, interaction. And I want to use 2 quotes, one from Bateson: buried deep in our processes of perception, how we see. And then in Conway, an organization's design system mirrors their own communication structure. So all of a sudden, the way I'm talking right now imprisons me, because in the way I'm talking and communicating, I already have a structure structuring what I see and how I see. So if we're looking for the emancipation that Klaus talks about, we had better be looking not just at level 1 reflexivity, but the structure of the structures of our perception. There is so little research on perception. I went this week with Dina Burleson on this dissertation by this woman who was dealing with perceptions. It was really profound, but there's such small literature on perceptions and the image that's formed in that perceptual world and what forms that image, the Kenneth Boulding issue of the image. So I just wanted to go through that as a first structure. Now, how do I get down? Oh, whoop, yep, yep, yep. Too far. Too far. Too far. Too far. Come on. Let me get out of this one. There we go. Now I can get back and navigate. Differential diagnosis, discerning the nature of the problem or whether the problem is a problem. So we have problems, we have tool sets, we have perceptions, we have communications to solve it. And then there's an order problem that is more difficult and deeply embedded. And the reason is we use the word observer, but that's just a code word for all the things that are processing, or in Lute's term, selection mechanisms of what we look at. So above the reflexive complex line, it's language, direct thinking, research within the contextual paradigm. Now, you look at a sentence, the sentence is the human epitome of a crystalline structure of how we think and act. It is a consolidation of a cultural structure. I don't care what culture you're coming from. It's a structure that structures you. So for those who speak in nouns, things, objects, you're looking at functional interactions that are ignored. It's a discrete object. Mathematics, you have 1 and a discrete object called 2. There is no memory of the 1 when you add those up, etc. So some of our tools like mathematics are discrete noun, thing, object, onesies, twosies, threesies, etc. Complicated change speaks in verbs, actions, purposes. That's multiplication and division sequences. Before, it's just additive, abstract. Yes. Here, so a sequence here all of a sudden matters. If you look at A plus B within B times C, it's not the same thing. You come up with 60 in one and what, 18 or so in the other, putting your numbers in. Analytic reassembly of parts. That works with all sorts of things. Putting a man on the moon, building your pyramids, damn it, that works. They're formed with subject predicate structuring. And you'll see how when you go beyond that, in the pre-verbal world of pre-subject predicate, you're in a different logic. This form of organizing promotes centralization, top-down communication hierarchies. If you're dealing in a sentence with nouns, verbs, adjective, adverbs, which are just the chorus, that's the way it works. Now, below you have reflexive complex line, and that's encased in the language, communication, and consciousness that should be the study of cybernetics. It's research at the edge or working with other paradigms. So reflexive means when the problem curves back on the structuring the problem. What's interesting in the American experiment is they were talking about circuits in 1700s of how a circuit operates and folds back on itself. And so it's about interrelationships, and that's dealing with conjunctives. Now, all computers are and, or, but, not, etc. Boolean algebra. That's very powerful. But what's really powerful is the interrelationships of the larger vocabulary of prepositions or punctuations, injunctions in a sentence. Because all of a sudden you're dealing with relationships and not things, verbs. So you have variable class reflexive problems. It's examination of the perspectives and judgments, practices. Two terms I want you to be thinking about. One is positionality, what we know and believe. And that is for the cybernetic critiques or critical theory. You can do a positionality of modern science, of what Jerry Chandler's doing with chemistry versus physics and mathematics. What's the positionality that gives rise to that epiphenomenon from the structure? And then there's the reflexivity. What do I do with that knowledge? But those are substitutable variables. Okay. Class 2 structural reflection problems, you have to understand the hardwiring, which is the structure, and the software of the language of the culture that determines the structure. And it's a function over the processes and the variables, but it's part of a whole equation, because there's just dealing with one part of an equation. The most powerful symbol in the world is the equal sign, the interaction. Let me see if I can do this again. So what am I interested in as a tool? What we need to do is, at the right side here, is level 1, problem filtered through our conscious construction, the processes. It's a reflexive meta processing, or the selection processes that Lowell talks about. What's really important is, we talk about structure, forming relationships, consciousness, the mirrored horizons, the reflection that we had talked about previously, and tautologies, which are part of a logic structure. Tautologies are links, but they contain no information. I'll give you some examples later on. The most important thing that I want you to get from this presentation is the structure and constraints wherein we create a system that reflexive, that falls back. What can change that is a type of learning or emergence. So within the system, you can scale. Same model, fractal, just keeps on going up. Over here on the left is higher levels of scope, which goes, and hopefully Jerry will be able to explain more about that later on, is the importance of scope versus just scale. Principles and standards, just like there in Netherlands and Philadelphia, when they're trying to figure out how do you change the system, what is it based upon, etc. But here it's the context and structures. So you need to analyze that and the learning. And there are, what Bateson talked about is basically 5 levels of learning. 0 learning means stimulus response, there's no learning. Learning within the system, learning about that system, and then ability to transcend those systems are levels of learning that we need to be thinking about. I just want to give you an example here. I got these things up here. What are they? How many fingers do you have? That's what we ask. In nature, you can see I'm coming from Bateson here, and the quote for this sort of slide is, the problems of the world is the difference between the way nature works and humans think. So when I talk about tautological links between propositions, they're empty. They contain no information about the subject. They just link them. Nature is based upon interrelationships and interactions. Now here's the key, the differential. Perhaps not all 5 fingers, that's quantitative. In Mesopotamia, when I was doing sacks of wheat and vessels of olive oil, I would do onesies, twosies, threesies, foursies, quantities. But the relationship between the fingers. Back in the 80s, I was working in software with some people, and we had a show at Wolf Trap. Some people from Disney came by, and they were fascinated because we're doing stuff with dance. I don't know if people know about Laban notation. It's a dance language that deals with all the interrelationships of limbs and heads and bodies and interaction. We created, if you ever notice Mickey Mouse has a glove, it's because doing 5 fingers in interaction is really tough in software programming. Because they were doing onesies, twosies, threesies and trying to manipulate it like this. What we did is say, no, think like nature. It's the calculation of the interrelationship of my thumb opposing this. And so it's a very simple program. The Disney people were totally amazed by this sort of thing. And so cybernetic critical theory is directed to clear up our premises. Tautologies, or being within the context, do not grow except in scale. Positive feedback loops, not scope. Growth development requires axes or axioms that can evolve. And that's why I mentioned about G. Spencer Brown being a little more. Last slide, and then I want to open up for discussions. Reflexive problems are superstructural, requiring moving between paradigms and context. And this is totally counterintuitive. Counterintuitive to the Disney people who are going to manipulate these fingers. No, it's simple. It's a relationship. It was a very elegant program. I was actually very proud of that. You're accessing higher cybernetic orders, and we have to be able to understand what those are and how they're formed and how they're deformed into creating social pathologies. If indeed, as Lute said, it's that epiphenomenon from the structure. So this comes from Alicia Guerrero, really wrote some very important things about the membrane around our world and constraints. So when everything is ultimately connected to everything else, you can't expect to isolate one aspect of the problem and by dealing with it, solve the problem. It's a senseless endeavor. That's the noun thinking, verb thinking. Context-free constraints. Context-free. Forget the context. I'm going to go look for the, a good example is we presented to military folks in Afghanistan a cultural strategy to deal with the Taliban who are using cultural weapons, basically. And I'll show you just a quick, diagram of what we showed them and why they couldn't understand it. They said, no, tell me who to kill. And let me go back. So context-free constraints cannot be the only way to encode information. This is really important. For if they were both biological development and evolution as we know it would be impossible. So we're dealing with something really different here, folks. You know, counterintuitive problem solving. By embodying context-sensitive constraints, context-sensitive meaning the membrane upon how I form my worldview, how the form in Netherlands and America were forming the supply chains of ideas. Mutualist feedback must be sensitive or constrained by its own past experiences. And this is a non-linear dynamic, which is historical, not temporal in the way that equilibrium and thermodynamic systems. So we have two different worlds of physics and biological evolutionary systems here. And what's important here is if you try to get freedom and transform that into liberty, that's the same thing. And what Alicia is trying to talk about here is combining those two hydrogen atoms and that one oxygen atom, because they have all sorts of degrees of freedom going back and forth. But when they combine and are constrained by one another, they develop a higher level of complexity and interaction, creating a totally new phenomenon of water in three phases, etc. Let me just give you an example of what we presented as the last thing to the defense people. This is a Lorentz strange attractor. Now, if you look at the red part over there, that's the terrorists. They were saying, how do we identify them, kill them? I said, no, you're part of a system of a culture that it's divided against itself. It's schismogenic in nature. So if you notice the way this is structured, there are launch pads and receptor pads from the host culture, which is weakened, to the terrorist culture. So unless you're able to come up with understanding where those vectors, eigenvectors, whatever you want to call them, are landing and launching, you can't change a society because you're just dealing with nouns and killing people. So the key is identification of the vectors that diverge from the mother culture, sanctioned by the host culture, and handcuffed together. So that's, I have many other slides because what I'm interested in is looking at physiology, the science of cybernetics that deal with the brain, etc., and the philosophy of cybernetics that deals with the limits of thought and the possibilities of thought. And until we bring those science and philosophy together, like natural history and natural science, cybernetics will not go very far. So, stop sharing.